Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast, where all the guys are in the same time zone. Tom and I are in Connecticut, and Glenn is in Indiana. That is a very far west place to be in the same time zone as people who are in Connecticut and Maine.
Yep.
Anyway, I'm C.R. Wiley. I am a pastor, and I am in the Pacific Northwest most of the time. I'm at my Connecticut house today, and I've written some stuff, and I'm finally wrapping up this AI book. And man, I'm so glad to have that nearly done. I really want it off my back. It's a depressing subject. I just want to get on to happier things. Anyway, that's me. So, Glenn, tell us about yourself.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor from Central Connecticut State University, so I used to be in Connecticut. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I've got my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries at eSquareInch.org, and I'm writing a fair amount of things on Substack and working actually on 3 books right now.
Wow, you are the man. You are the man. Okay, Tom, tell us about yourself and take us into the subject of the day.
Okay, I'm Tom Price. I teach theology and Christian ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I do ministry work as well at a local church. And I do writing and have a lot of writing projects that continuously are making progress, and hopefully over this break can wrap some of that up. We will see.
Yeah, well, if we were Catholics, we could say that they would go on into purgatory and that this would just kind of, take as long as you want.
That's right. And I believe it was one of these. It took 14 years. Wasn't it Tolkien? 14 years
Sure.
to finally deliver on what was promised. So I'm feeling.
So are you making your own languages?
I am. I've been working with my own language for a long time. And Augustine, of course, said we couldn't, and so did Wittgenstein. But
spending a long time writing books, like, say, the second book in a trilogy, things like that, just get really annoying.
Yeah. I'm with you.
I wish I could be 3 people sometimes.
Okay, so what are we talking about?
Talking about deformations, theological deformations that give birth to strange, shadowy parodies of the original thing. What I have in mind here is deformations that have happened in Western Christianity, especially deformations of the classic Augustinian vision, which has had a big mark on Western Christianity in particular. And the way in which some of those deformations set the groundwork for what we would see as some of the motivations for the modern world that move towards an increased idea of being secular and self-sufficient without much need for any kind of direct theological talk about God in terms of nature or purposes or meaning or making sense of ourselves. And so is it possible to trace some of that or all of that shift to a strong emphasis on empirical science and progressive development towards the betterment of the natural world without mentioning that there is a theological setting that helped give birth to it? We've talked a lot about kind of the contributions of Christianity in positive ways to what we would see the positive aspects of the modern world and modern science. But what about those that are a little more, less positive in the long run, even though they started out with great promise? And in particular, I'm interested in the empirical tradition in probably 18th century. And kind of its indebtedness in some places, for example, Scotland with David Hume, to the kind of, Calvinistic, a certain kind of Calvinistic setting to which Hume was responding to and reacting to, and the way in which that gave birth to some things which still depended on that theology.
Well,
but this is in different directions.
Yeah, this is a fascinating thing to explore, because I don't think there's anybody out there that I know of that's working in this sort of field, and it seems obvious to me. Now, I'm not a Humean scholar, and I don't know enough about the Scottish Reformation to work with what was going on in terms
You're
of
a
the theologians.
Presbyterian.
I know, yeah, I know. But I'm an honest one, and and I know my limits. But I've always had this intuition that there's a connection, and it's always struck me as kind of Calvinism gone bad, or Calvinism gone to seed, or Calvinism, but there's still that Calvinistic sort of air to it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that interests me.
Yeah, and to bring it back to Augustine, Calvin was heavily influenced by
Sure.
Augustine.
Well,
there have been studies of his sources, and overwhelmingly, among the fathers, he's very well read among the fathers, but Augustine is his go-to guy.
Yeah.
People have said that Western philosophy is really just a series of footnotes to Plato.
Yeah.
You can argue that Western theology is a series of footnotes to Augustine.
Yeah.
I've even secular thinkers know that he's a giant, and I've heard them attribute the first autobiography to him with Confessions, and just his whole approach with the City of God and everything. By the way, I've got something here. I'm going to show folks out there that'll probably freak people out, but I got it actually from our Orthodox friends at 8th Day Books, and they had it for sale at a Touchstone conference a few years back. And I got to get that. Just because it's a conversation piece. Just so you know, I don't pray to it. But anyway, here is an icon of Augustine, and I bought it for $39. And you too can have an icon of Augustine.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, like I said, I don't treat it as an icon. It's
we've definitely venerate Augustine in different ways, and one of the ways that John Rist, a great historian of ideas, Catholic philosopher as well, is he wrote one, of course. Plato Baptized was one of his famous works, but his other one was Augustine Deformed. And of course, his argument will be that even though, for example, key reformers like Calvin and Luther and others have a huge debt to retrieving Augustinian themes and definitely want to hold on to Augustinian understandings of grace, but because the theological setting shifted, as we've talked about over and over again, there's a stronger emphasis on voluntarism and a more deeply held suspicion of reason than Augustine ever had, a more heightened understanding of the notion of depravity that is very different than kind of the way Augustine would have articulated it. These, what Rist will call deformations or overemphases, take on a kind of lifeblood of their own. And they settle into the mindset of the places they impact, like Scotland, that set things up for Hume. And they created their own kind of conditions for a certain kind of response. And maybe it's good for me to back up a little bit, because there's a way of putting this that I think I'm just learning to articulate it, but I think I'm seeing this pattern develop. Go back to ancient understandings of philosophy and ancient understandings of theology, and you will, or religion, and you see them very connected. Yeah. Even psychology, for that matter. We've talked about the word psychagogy, which is really the way in which philosophy itself was understood basically the way we think almost as a school of religion. It's a place where you diagnose a problem and then you address a solution. So it definitely has, it's understood as a setting for that, a school for that, a community for that, and theology very similarly.
Yeah, it was therapeutic understanding.
Therapeutic, but definitely not in the kind of reductionist way.
Yeah, not the way we do it. Yeah.
But yes, you're right. There is a salvation as bringing health to the whole. And so different schools of philosophers were different, or different religions were different approaches to that diagnosis and then prescribed solution. And a lot of it was a kind of spiritual anxieties. Well, one could almost...
Tom, just one quick note here that I don't know if we really want to go in this direction, but the entire concept of religion is a peculiarly Christian and Western idea.
Yeah.
Because in virtually every other culture, and in the early church, religion was just something that was integrated into life. It wasn't a separate category.
Yeah, it was just life.
Yeah. So of course, your philosophy or psychology, whatever you want to call it, all of those things are, in religion is deeply intertwined with them, because that category does not exist except as a rather peculiar thing that happened in the Western world.
Yeah.
Post-Christian.
Yeah. Yeah, and Christianity has its own, it has a kind of weird relationship with the idea of religion as well. What we end up with now is very different than the way it was conceived, even during the Reformation. But prior to that, where it was understood as a virtue, and it was understood as your due justice given to what is ultimate. But the integration, the move towards a kind of division between life and belief comes with kind of splits that show up around the time of empiricism in Western Christianity, where ritual and outward performance get severed from the ethics of belief. But I'll get there in a moment. But anyway, back to this thing. I kind of think what I'm seeing happening with a figure like Hume and the development of empiricism, which gives a lot to setting the table for modern science and the modern view of the self, is almost a therapeutic set of arguments being made. With Hume in particular, you have him wrestling over the Calvinistic context of a world that is morbidly scrupulous with their interiority, that they don't know if they're the elect. And what do you do with that? And there was a huge amount of anxiety in that world about, this is where the whole notion of diary changes, right? The whole notion of writing down your life to be able to see if you're in the in group rather than the out group, one who manifests, manifestations of your election versus not. There was a lot of this in the atmosphere. And one of the things Hume is wrestling with is the first kind of philosophical byproduct of that towards a secular way of thinking. There was a move to a strong emphasis on one's inner life. And there was a lot of anxieties bound up with a self so inwardly focused that it was dealing with these existential questions. What is it all about? How do I fit into it all? And so Hume almost sees the empirical philosophy as a way of ridding us from that anxiety. The move towards nature outside, the move towards sociability, distracting oneself from big metaphysical questions to go play chess with your friends. This conception of a self, not so hung up on the religious certitude of one's inward state, much less big metaphysical questions, was a kind of a therapeutic turn, as much as it was also an intellectual way of grappling through,
in other words, just kind of getting back in touch with real life, or just the daily routines and things that you just need to be able to enjoy and the duties you need to perform, rather than obsessing all the time.
Obsessing of it.
To jump in here, this is going to sound very much Weberian. The idea that the entire Protestant work ethic is built around salvation anxiety. The problem with that is that when you actually look at things like Perkins' Golden Chain, which is a book that's designed to show you where you are in the process of true conversion, it nothing has to do with how economically prosperous you are. Yeah. So the idea that was seen as a sign of election is sort of a red herring. It really wasn't. It's this inferiority that you're talking about here that was the real issue.
So Glenn, just quick, let me just ask Tom. I'm not familiar with that book. Is there any stress on good works in it?
I believe that there is some, but it's been a long time since I've read it.
Okay.
We're going back to the early 80s here.
Yeah. Right. And I don't know that the context of Hume was such that the works element, as much as kind of what true piety was and authentic belief. I mean, you're dealing with a world, this is something Peter Harrison's getting to in his most recent book, Some New World, is that when you move from implicit belief to having to ethics of belief, is his way of putting it, to where you have to justify now your theological vision over against other Christian theological visions. You didn't have to do this before because you had basically a theological vision. You may have had debates within a tradition, but you didn't have this view of Christianity saying, no, we're the genuine article and having to make a case for it. So the notion of belief and assent to the right doctrines, and then grounding those doctrines in scripture, and then biblical reasoning, and then evidences, this creates a different framework, but it could also likewise create a certain kind of anxieties for people who cannot muster up a way of resolving that. I mean, then you have the wars going on where, again, this is something where the classic view of the self, where reason sort of, Christianity took over the Hellenic view and altered it, where reason kind of governs, orders, the loves and reason order the rest of you, including your passions. Passion wasn't looked at as a good way of running your life. It was looked at very negatively. And so you have a de-emphasis on the passions, or a way of really bringing them under your kind of bringing them into order so that they don't get out of hand. So like modern notions of falling in love where passion takes over, that would have looked like a sickness in some of these.
Actually, people who were controlled by their passions were considered effeminate.
Yes, yeah.
If you actually look at the language that's used, because someone who's truly masculine has their passions under control. They're controlled by their reason.
Yeah,
right.
And so as reason starts to become, especially when a more strong emphasis on will, the emphasis on the will in Western theology, 14th, 15th, 16th century, strong emphasis on will. Now, all of a sudden, reason is looked at very suspiciously as really a cloak for kind of certain kinds of desires, kind of justifying themselves, or certain dispositions of the will, or something else, self-interest, cloaking itself behind argument. You start to see a lot of suspicions coming out of a certain overemphasized Augustinianism that has a suspicion of reason for the right reasons, but it becomes clouded to the point where reason completely is not very trustworthy. And then you have religious wars you have confessional groups passionate about their creed, but reason isn't able to resolve them. And so you have conditions that are setting up for, okay, what do we do here? And I mean, I think Glenn could pretty much talk about how Hobbes had a solution in an environment like that, which very much is moving towards a new recognition of the self that sees radical self-interest and my own self-benefit, much less survival, as central to what it means to be a self. And this is, I think, what I'm getting at, is that this negative reading of the self, which should be there because of the fall, starts to almost become seen as what nature is itself. And so nature is not merely fallen, that's what nature is. And so they don't think we can get back to some kind of original place, because that's what nature is as nature. It's fallen. So it almost makes it a full reality. And then it says, well, what do we do with it now?
Right. So let me put it the way that it's occurred to me in the past, because you're tracking with some things that I've been thinking about or had thought about, but had put in different ways. Tell me if there's something that I'm missing. So, I've thought about, say, wokeism as a kind of Calvinism without redemption. It's a completely immanentized understanding of original sin.
Yeah.
And but then there's a kind of also squirrely development where the powerless, because they can't effectuate anything, are in effect the innocent. They're somehow untainted by this other thing that taints everybody else who actually has agency. And so it's almost like agency is is a sign of your fallenness.
Yes.
So basically, what you don't want to be is to be agentic. What you want to be is a victim.
Yes. Yeah. And here is what they started to regard, take Locke, the state of nature. They often talk about the state of nature, and the state of nature was something they recognized as it It was increasingly being understood not as, the world of real universals where there is a human nature that is shared across the board, but you have individual humans. The individuality becomes very important. And knowing these things comes through your experience of each particular and your experience through your senses. That's how you know. And it works good in a climate at which, if reason can't be trusted, well, what about your senses? Well, your senses navigate you all the time. They get you through the world in a practical rather than metaphysical or theological way. So if we bracket our knowledge there, then we're getting a hold of the best way we can understand reality and ourselves, and why push it too far beyond that? And so what you begin to see is, if self-interest and self-preservation and survival are essential to the individual human or each individual thing, why? I mean, you can read it negatively like a Hobbes and then, figure out a way to top down control it all. Or you could be like a Hume and say, well, if instinct to preserve yourself is part of what it means to be a natural human being, why is that so bad after all? Why not just recognize it as reality and then see it as a good that can either be directed towards good ends or not?
Yeah. So how does this tie into, say, Hume's, theory of moral sentiments, but basically, sympathy becomes the basis of morality, and rather than, say, precepts or laws or truth or just moral judgment.
Well, I mean, that the notion where I think the whole move towards that sentiment, it's a self-interest move. I think that's
right. Yeah,
that's what is, and you'll hear this over and over again. Basically, you would do these kind of things because if you were in the same situation,
right.
You hear that echoed over and over again. But that kind of ethic, I mean, they would read definitely that you cannot, there isn't the kind of natural law the way we used to understand it.
Right.
As a matter of fact, for a lot of them, there is no teleology there. There just is certain ways that nature's ordered itself and oriented, and you just have to accept it. But this becomes something of, it takes away from it takes the Augustinian fallen world, and rather than see it as something that has redemption breathed back into it from any transcendent reality, which can be renewed and can become a big sacramental vision, they reject that altogether. It becomes immanentized, and our relationship to it is.
But here's the thing. I think that's really a great insight. So what I was getting at earlier with this idea of his theory of moral sentiments is empathy. The idea that this is the thing that we shouldn't question. Any kind of impulse that we can say is a manifestation of empathy is de facto pure and morally really prescriptive. I mean, we have to do it. But you're bringing out the fact that because there's no transcendent basis for this, that it basically is just me reading myself into somebody else and trying to pursue my own interests, kind of, without being aware that that's what I'm doing or not being honest about it. There's no real sacrifice, in other words.
Yeah, and they would, and then with Hume, I just don't think he sees that as a bad thing, and I think he thinks that kind of doesn't have to go negative. That self-interest can create sociability, and you need friendship, and it may start out selfish, but you do get something from it, and you give something to it, and they would see that as actually a positive way to indulge certain kinds of healthy exhibitions of your self-interst, and that you are. They are real good.
The fable of the bees wasn't that it? Who wrote that initially? Basically, the idea that and it gets back. It's the classic expression is like the baker doesn't bake bread for other people; he bakes bread to make a profit.
Yeah.
But then there's this sort of unintended social good that follows. I can't remember who the fable of the bees. Maybe I'm misapplying that to this, but anyway.
But you do see it likewise with the Adam Smith's turn of self-interest into the working class, and of course to directing that self-interest towards competitive as goods rather than negatives in Adam Smith. So you start to see these Augustinian negatives overemphasized in a negative way, that they can't really be redeemed, or in a very limited sense, just kind of tolerated and dealt with, to a positive development of that negativity. And it's a kind of
Yeah. So, by the way, I looked up Fable of the Beast. It's Bernard Mandeville.
okay.
And it's basically the idea that private vices lead to public goods. That's
Yeah.
the idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit in there, but it's different.
Yeah. But I do think it is just interesting that, I mean, for example, the notion of original sin is kind of bracketed out here. It's now just, you just have nature, and in some sense, we're born as a blank slate. We don't have anything.
Right.
We're not carrying anything from the past in that way. Now, later, when we start to understand genetics and psychological inheritance, maybe that will be different. But then you have a different notion of the human self, in which the human self here is not this, this true inner self. That is not from the empirical tradition. That is from that's the other horn, the Cartesian line in many ways, and the Kantian line. That's the rationalist strand disconnected from a full theological vision. The empiricist is another way. You're kind of a bundle of sense impressions. This is very nominalist. Right. You don't know trees because there aren't any trees out there. You have an experience of what we will name a tree, but there is no tree essence there and these leave an impression, and that impression is all you have. And then it's the way in which you give order through your faculties to those sense experiences. And this is, I think, so you have a psychological self, and a psychological self is sort of just a continuity of those sense experiences that you can remember. And it's a memory-based identity. Now, all those things you can't remember are not part, therefore, of your self. So if you forgot memories, that Freud tries to bring up later, those forgotten memories would not be considered part of yourself. It's that which you can consciously remember. Formative years of your childhood for them are rarely considered part of your identity.
Yeah, except that if you go to Lockean psychology, those formative years are the things that form the basic structure of your mind.
Yeah.
Because your mind is an absolutely blank slate. You collect sensory data. Your brain categorizes it. Your mind categorizes it. And that's how you begin making sense of the world, which then leads to an entire educational approach. You want to give your children as wide a range of experiences as possible, because that will make them as smart as they can be.
Yeah.
You want to do the grand tour. You want to do all of those things at the appropriate times.
Yeah. I think it's the continuity of self. I think even with Locke, the continuity of a self-identity, though, however formed the slate is what they account for being a continuous self. In other words, they don't think you have an inner core. They don't think you have a ghost in the machine. I don't either. But for that matter, that was the alternative. It's a crass way that Riley put it. But say a Cartesian ghost in the machine, some kind of inner self that remains the same across time, even through all your bodily changes and developments. It may grow in terms of certain psychological relationships, but it's the same true essence. That is something this is a rejection of. You don't have this kind of same self across time. What links the self is not some shared essence so much as continuous sets of experience, and they're connected through memory plays that significant role here. But yes, formation, there is nothing to remember or capacity to do it without the formation. So those things are important, but they don't constitute one's quote unquote inner self. But the thing is for Hume, this very much is an outward directed sense of self, where you would have with Descartes, you turn inward, you kind of ground your reason and move toward, the extension. It moves outward. Here it's the other way around. You're oriented towards the world that leaves impressions. And this starts to build the sense relationship to the world, the empirical world, that therefore is the ground of all true knowledge and knowing, and therefore sets the table for strong empirical approaches to knowing. And again, it's a way through your sense experience and the impressions they leave that's the only thing you can have knowledge of, which brackets out metaphysics, theology, and everything else altogether. These things aren't something you can get to that way.
Yeah, and the other consequence of this, which is one that interests me personally, is the way in which the traditional hierarchies by which knowledge was organized are dismantled.
Yeah.
So, it used to be, if you were working with the equivalent of an encyclopedia, it would be organized thematically around a logical structure of knowledge. What leads to what? So you need to study geometry before you can do optics, or whatever. And ultimately, theology is the one that is the integration point for all of them. I mean, this is the traditional way of doing it. But what ends up happening is once you accept the idea that knowledge is based entirely on sense perception and all of these relationships we build are arbitrary, then you move into a sphere in which you get rid of all the arbitrary relationships. Yeah. But then how do you organize knowledge? You do it. We've talked about this before. You do it alphabetically.
Yeah.
So the encyclopedia, Diderot and D'Alembert's encyclopedia, is the first systematic book that is arranged really just alphabetically. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to break down these hierarchies of knowledge, which they believed were arbitrary, and they wanted to give people the opportunity to create their own.
Yeah. Returning to that theme, though, it's, I think, surprising to discover, it was for me over the years, just things like what you've noted with Diderot's encyclopedia. It was just more or less, presented to me as like just the common sense way to organize things. It wasn't presented to me as, it was presented as just an a means by which you can access information quickly if you can remember what a word began with, right? That kind of thing. But there are also kind of sort of traditions and practices that are still with us that reflect the older way of thinking. And we've talked about this before, the pomp and circumstance in a traditional graduation at a college or a university. The hoods are colored in a way that helps to distinguish the more important disciplines from kind of the clerk work, that kind of thing. And then even as the procession, is traditionally conducted, it's theology and philosophy that lead the way, and that's intended to say something about the way things are supposed to be ordered. But most folks don't even know that. I mean, most folks don't even have an idea what the hoods are about, right? You dress up funny when you graduate.
They're like monuments to a strange other world that we take for granted because there's still things we don't fully understand. They're traditions, and we do need those, but until we replace them with something else, they remain, and they remain an enigma because they do speak about things that don't follow from the way they see often the world now, and don't know why they do them. And this is why, it's the old saying, don't remove a stone until you know why it was placed there. Right. I mean, it's similar with, certain forms of religious life that we continue to do through all these ages. And some people just come in and think you can jettison them and not do something fundamentally harmful, where you don't necessarily want to quite play around with something. And this is, I think, the thing, this loosening of tradition and hierarchy as constructed. And this is, Hume was very much on board with this, that the world that we know out there is not a real world of of universal realities that have inherent meanings, purposes, and orders to them. They are individual things we can know through their impressions, but we're the ones who are bringing, through our imagination and interpretation, we're bringing meaning and placing meaning and value on those things. It's a constructed world. This stuff was not just developed yesterday in the social sciences. These thinkers thought that way. Language itself becomes a very peculiar thing. But one of the things I think with Hume that a lot of people don't realize, especially because I think Enlightenment context, but he flips the notion of the self from reason on top and passions on the bottom to passions on top.
Right.
Why? Because nature becomes kind of the God term here. And how could nature not do something otherwise than what was best for us so that we can survive and thrive? And so for him, instinct, which he identified basically with this kind of raw natural passions, these are goods to be trusted. You're to trust your instincts.
So many of the things that people assume are kind of recent developments, with an explanation like you're providing, Tom, help us to see that no, this stuff goes a long way back, and we're kind of working it out into sort of the logical, sort of extensions.
We're at the logical ends of it.
Right.
Yeah.
What I'm struck by is how this ties in with Plantinga's argument against Darwinism. His argument against Darwinism says, hey, look, if Darwinism is true, then the only thing that we are selected for is survivability. We are not selected for actually understanding the world.
Right. Yeah.
So if Darwinism is correct, we have no reason to believe Darwinism is correct because we can't trust our reason.
Right. And kind of extrapolating on that idea, this idea that, say, intelligent life would be just like ubiquitous in the cosmos if we could just get in a rocket ship that would fly fast enough to take us to all these marvelous alien civilizations out there. No, what we might actually have if we take Darwin seriously, is we are the most overcompensated animals that ever existed, and it was a complete fluke. In other words, there's no sort of necessary sort of result that we are an example of. It just kind of weird. It just happened, that's it, And what I mean by overcompensate is what you're getting at. I mean, what does all the stuff that we do have to do with survival? I mean, what does, you might say, well, there are variations on the theme and all these different kinds, but still, I mean, it's just, we're overcompensated. No other creature that we can look at, with the possible exception of dolphins, has a kind of overcompensated brain that we have, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, that's why the transcendentals never fit in. Things pursued for their own sake, and the things that you can't prove that they, but that it ends up in a circle. After you just can't. Once you buy into that set of, just like behind every single claim is nothing more than will. This is another distortion of Augustine, who recognized that, yes, behind our reasons is oftentimes the other reasons for why we're reasoning the way we are. But he didn't reduce everything to that, for sure. He had a participatory and illuminative understanding of knowing a comprehensive context to balance that out, where once that goes, well, once everything is just will, you get Foucault, will to power, and Nietzsche and Foucault, that all relationships are really just power differentials of self-interest, and all selves are nothing more than social roles in that, that hierarchy of competitive powers, or, but then again, the strange thing for someone like a Foucault is, why would he be worried about it? I mean, if that is the way nature is, and you're accepting that as the given, what is it that's making you a little uncomfortable, and you want to flatten that out a little bit so that everyone is, equal, or others can have a share in it?
What's the basis of the moral, sort of agenda? It's just that's basically, I think it's one of the reasons why these people are just generally miserable people.
Yeah,
there's really no kind of ability to identify anything worth living for, apart from destroying other people who maybe have an advantage over you. I mean, it's just a miserable way to think about life.
Yeah. But I think this is one of the things that, back to Hume, they were wrestling with, of course, the theodicy question, and in again, a kind of overemphasized Augustinian world where judgment and the love of God felt very far removed and only given to a few people, if at all. It's for someone like Hume, the development of a kind of natural religion, with kind of God, the God term being nature, it leads itself to a kind of deism that makes a lot of sense for them, because on the one hand, you have a God who kind of, helps you explain how it all got here and why it has a kind of, a certain kind of way of allowing life to go on and move towards survival and things like that. But you don't have to worry about explaining all the irregularities and all the rest, because for them, I think the fall had lost its ability to explain without creating for them a kind of hyper anxiety. And for here, you just basically remove God from any interest in the world, and therefore no interest in your own inner moral orientation. You rid yourself of the worry of anxiety, and you free yourself to kind of live in the world and pursue it as given, and accept it as kind of reality that you can shape and direct as within the limits that you have to shape and direct it. And therefore, you can only have probable knowledge, and that will always increase and grow, but you never have absolute knowledge, and you don't need to. You can live with a lot of uncertainty, knowing that this is the best you're going to be given. But there is an interesting thing. He has that, what is it, Dialogues on Natural Religion. I think that was, and he has basically the orthodox in there, and then kind of the view he's representing here, kind of natural religion, lead to a kind of deism. But religion takes on a different tone, but it still has echoes of its reaction to this deformed Augustinian context.
I think we have to back up a moment, though, to talk about probability and probabilism.
Yeah.
Probabilism is the idea that knowledge is entirely based on probability, not certainty.
Yeah.
And actually, the pioneer in that was Blaise Pascal.
Right.
Yeah.
We did a show years ago about barometers.
Another Augustinian.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about that was a response to exactly the same kinds of things that Descartes was trying to respond to. By trying to find a ground of certainty. Because up to this point, epistemology was really built around the idea of certain knowledge. You can't really claim something was true unless you knew it was certainly true. And Pascal is the guy who really, promotes, gets probabilism on the agenda that really solves the problem of certainty. Problem of certainty goes back to Pyrrhonical skepticism. Pyrrho was he actually went with Alexander the Great to India. He was accompanied Alexander the Great. And while he was in India, he ran into these Indian philosophers who argued that ignorance is the basic reality, not knowledge, which is the complete antithesis of the Greek view. And these Indian philosophers, when Pyrrho tried to argue with them, the Indian philosophers took him apart, because they showed him he could not be certain about anything that he said. And he brought this back with him, and he developed a methodology that was built on asking questions. I've described Pyrrho as the toddler from hell, because, the toddler's most dreaded question is why. They keep asking why, until you finally in frustration say because, and they say, oh, okay, and walk off. Pyrrho didn't. He didn't walk off. And he, his entire methodology was based on destroying certainty. And he never made a statement. He never made an epistemological statement. He didn't say you can't know anything with certainty. He just developed a methodology to show you couldn't. And when that arrived in the late 16th century, it went off like a bomb in Europe among the intellectual class, because they'd been assuming certainty was possible. And Pyrrho showed it wasn't.
Let's just think a little bit about Pascal here in this respect, because we have his wager, which is his probabilistic apologetic. It always leaves people unsatisfied, but at another level they think, well, yeah, I guess that is kind of the best bet, But related to to all that is his own conversion experience, which was not a rational kind of thing. It was a kind of it was a revelation. It was a burning fire. It was something that reoriented his life, but wasn't based on necessarily truth claims. In fact, he dismisses the truth claims in his own record of the conversion, not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, but again, what that shows is a kind of a longing for certainty through ecstatic experience, which isn't completely unrelated to what Hume was doing, and you could say.
Yeah, well, this is what Peter Harrison's getting at in the reason thing. Once implicit faith, which most people had in Christianity because they were part of Christian culture, and you didn't have to have all your beliefs worked out to be able to trust the authorities who you held were divinely ordained, and it was a belief where you weren't sitting around skeptical like the world in which you wouldn't be questioning it. It's kind of like the givens when you're a child, that you're not sitting, or you don't see typically a 6-year-old sitting around, pondering the givens. They're there for them. For most of Western Christianity, it was there for them. You didn't have to know. I mean, it wasn't part of the test to be a Christian to be able to justify your beliefs the way we have later, maybe among theologians. But even I think Harrison is right in his book. The arguments for the existence of God were never about certainty. You can't read Aquinas and get it. These are, if you read what Aquinas says, he goes, everyone knows there's a God. In other words, we all know that there's something ultimate. Then it becomes a spiritual exercise of purifying your reason to come to that which the attributes must look like in order to intelligibly make sense of what must be.
Well, the point you just made there about purifying your reason, I think, is a really good one. To revisit, because I don't think people consider reason to be pollutable.
Well, that's the Christian notion. This is I think the healthy Augustinian that it is, but it isn't just Christianity. This old school of Plato was clearly in the tradition of purifying your knowledge so you can see properly, and you can relate to things the right way. Lewis carries out this whole thing, right? And Christianity, it's completely there. It's in it. I would say purifies it fully. But one of the things I think John Riss does well is he talks about some key areas where Augustine was deformed. And he kind of gives a picture. This is what Augustine looked like. This is what the deformation looks like. And again, so one of the things he talks about with Augustine, he had an integrated vision, of course, divine illumination, which is where knowledge is found, participation. All of reality is a participant in, the mind and purposes of God, and therefore illuminatable and knowable. And your relationship is not things outside pressing in, but you're sharing. You're in a shared way of communicating. And moral formation. These things are very central. And so when you look at an authentic epistemology or study of how we know things, for Augustine, you have knowledge is possible because the human mind actually participates in divine light. This is how he would understand. Truth is not constructed or discovered empirically, but received first through illumination. You look at John's gospel, right? Christ, the light that illumines everyone. Of course, that gets dimmed, right? But sensory data, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient to be able to give a full account. And so, of course, knowing requires rightly ordered loves. There's the purification of our desires, right? Moral and spiritual formation and participation in the Logos, ultimately, one either in creation, but ultimately in Christ, where what you get is a break in that. You have it move to something where a kind of disordering happens. And I think one of the ways he puts it at is when you had a loss of illumination, then you still kept a kind of suspicion of reason, but it took on a different role. And that's where the effects of the fall start to get so emphasized, where the human intellect cannot be trusted at all. And you did see this begin to develop in certain pockets of
Right.
of the Reformation and Jansenism in some cases as well.
So let's stop here and just reflect for a minute, because I think this is helpful. So this turning away from reason, it's still with us in Protestantism, particularly in circles that make a point of saying that reason is not to be trusted. We should only trust the Bible.
Yeah.
But then they set themselves up for what happens when the kid goes to school and he learns that, there's this thing called literary theory, and that when you read, you're not actually just reading what other people think. You're actually in the process of reading, kind of using the text to further your own agendas, and the person who wrote it had an agenda. And next thing you know, you get a woke preacher in some church in the Midwest, who feels like he's had this moment of illumination. I finally see that I can't even read the Bible anymore, and so therefore I'm just going to use it as a tool to further my political agenda. In other words, it's not a means by which we are illuminated any longer.
You're more likely to run into those preachers on the coasts than in the Midwest.
That's true. That's right. Yeah, I know what you mean.
But it's interesting what you say there, because what you have is the skepticism of trusting our reason that Augustine was correct about has been severed from Augustine's participatory economy, where everything is sharing in the illumination of the divine. Scripture would definitely have a role here. Now Scripture has become subject to that skepticism, right? And so what happens once the Augustinian skepticism gets rid from that participatory context of illumination, and then what you end up having is it replaced with what they kind of call a minimalist approach, to where you begin to rely more on what appears less corrupted. And for the empiricist tradition, it was sense experience.
Mm-hmm.
It was the senses were not affected the same way that the reason was, and that's a very interesting shift of emphasis.
Yeah,
and so
I'd never heard it put that way, but it makes sense. Yeah,
and then the next part is the universal and necessary truths now lack grounding, and so now knowledge has now been relocated to sensory immediacy, to what you can right now, not contemplate out of the different things like the treeness of the tree, but the individual tree itself, that immediate encounter.
So we got to get a different way of talking about essences, because when you say treeness or tableness or turness, it just makes you seem goofy. So we got to find a new way to talk about it.
Yeah. The tree. Yeah. Well, it is a hard one to think of, to put it in different ways.
I'm just saying that whenever I've done that, and I'm teaching philosophy, and I can see people kind of like smirking in the back,
the treeness of the tree, which shows how given they are already too.
Yeah, you could use dendriticism.
You have to explain that one there, Glenn. I don't know what you mean.
Well, the Greek word for tree is related to, I forgot the exact form of it, but dendritic would be tree-like. So dendriticism is
Okay.
And
dendros was the Greek word for tree, if I remember right. Yeah.
Well, the other one was that shift that happened in West is, of course, moral psychology, and the notion of the kind of isolated self replaced, and Augustine often gets blamed for giving the West these things. I don't think that's fair and accurate. He does give us a notion of the inner life. You read his book on the Trinity and his approach, but he does not have in mind what ended up happening. And basically, for him, the self is relational and participatory. I mean, read the Confessions. He does not we call it his autobiography. It's what Charles Matthews, I think, brilliantly called its anti-autobiography. It is, the first thing is praise of God. I mean, this already is locating,
right?
And then it becomes the way in which the things of the world, like Lewis says, the gifts of God's love to us come through the things of the world, like the mother's caring nurture, the different things in which we're provided for. So anyway, it's a different framework where what ends up is dominating is kind of the inward turn in the West, rid of that participatory.
This reminds me of a of a philosopher that I had as professor, and he was assessing the different strands of Christianity, and he said, this is pretty much the case. Whatever the cardinal doctrine is becomes its greatest weakness.
Yeah.
So it's like, when you think of like Catholicism and, the Catholic Church, that becomes the place where it has a lot of trouble. When and you can kind of go to the different traditions and say, okay, this is our thing. And then that's the place where everything gets kind of runs amok eventually.
It produces a bad shadow when it gets twisted. And so one of the things that develops, of course, is an isolated introspective self. We've seen this enough in the modern world, but this becomes cut off from transcendence, unlike Augustine. And then the focus here now becomes grounding knowledge internally or empirically, either the inner self, in my own self-certitude with Descartes, or the way in which I can know things through my senses, and there can be a consensus of other shared experiencers in a kind of shared social world. But there you're lending yourself already to social construction at Page. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how with these developments, there's sort of like the embryo of the next weird destructive thing that's about to burst forth, like the alien in like the film Alien.
That's it. But I think overall you get really a distrust of the intellect, a loss of illumination, and then a turn to the senses. This becomes really the end result of that deformation. But it really radically realters the conception of religion and everything else. And it sets the groundwork for a relationship, I think, in the natural sciences that create a different psychology and relationship to and understanding of the natural world, natural things and kinds, what knowledge is, what it's about, how we stand towards it. We've talked a lot about it, but I think on the last note is I think someone who wanted to reintegrate that vision was a good friend of the Inklings. That was Christopher Dawson. He was a very, very Catholic man, but someone who did appreciate the Protestants that hadn't deformed their Augustinianism. And one of the things he'll talk about often is how there is no society, not even a secular society, that isn't grounded in some spiritual vision. There is what he will use the term just generally, there is a religion. And one of the things I'm trying to show is that the kind of religion that is at the root of secularism is a kind of, in certain strands, a deformed Augustinianism. And it has the character of that the more you pay attention. That's why if you read like Peter Harrison's books, I think one of the ones I mentioned earlier, The Fall of Man and the Foundations of Science, and his other one, kind of the Bible, Protestantism, and the Rise of Natural Science, he traces a lot of that kind of that relationship to that kind of Augustinian setting. We've talked about Bacon before and other figures too. But for Dawson, he argues basically Western Christianity as a whole, it is underwritten by St. Augustine. I mean, that vision. Yeah. And it becomes deformations again that create the problems. But for him, at the heart of it is not simply a theory of church-state relations. It's about history, and in history is about kind of how we order and disorder loves. And he really reads the whole of history and culture that way, and that there isn't a way out of it. And so this struggle that we're dealing with in the West, there isn't a way out of it. These malformed loves, it really becomes giving the best sense of intelligibility and illumination to it. And for him, it's a renewal of an Augustinian Christian vision that he would call sanctifying the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great note to end on. Do you have anything you wanted to add, Glenn?
Yeah, just two quick things. First of all, because somebody is going to point this out, it's dendron, not dendros. It's neuter, not masculine. Somebody's going to point that out. So I want to, But more importantly, the interesting thing is that within the broadly rational rationalistic world, there's an attempt to bring together empiricism and reason.
Yeah.
So what you get in something like logical positivism is a statement is meaningful if it is empirically verifiable or logically necessary.
Yeah.
So there's an attempt to bring the two of them together, but it really lacks the foundation for all the reasons you've talked about for that to actually be coherent.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Anything you want to wrap up with here, Tom?
No, this is just a lot of sketched out.
Yeah.
There's sketches of some things I'm thinking about, but I'm trying to tie some threads together that I know are there, but I want to dig out a little bit more.
Well, it's been really helpful to me. It's gotten me thinking about some things in a different way. I was aware of some of the things that you brought up, but I didn't quite interpret them the way that you've been discussing them. So it's been great. Anyway, thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. We're glad you're with us for a new year, 2026. Wow. Anyway, one of the things we're looking forward to in the coming year is a trip to Scotland. We're still a little up in the air, or a lot up in the air, about when and all that kind of stuff. But as soon as we know, we will let you know. It's not going to be in the spring. We're not going to be there in May like we were in Oxford a couple of years back. But it's more likely going to be the fall, which I guess is appropriate for Scotland. It'll be dark. It'll be gloomy. It'll be gothic. Anyway.
Well, that's where it wasn't that where Hume was.
That's right. That's right. We'll be in that place. Anyway, also we really appreciate all the people who support us on Patreon. If you want to join that great band of folks, there's a link in the show notes, and if you just follow that link, you'll see. You'll learn about the ways you can help. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.